I'm curious, when do you see naltrexone and the Sinclair method not work for people?
Yeah, so of course, yeah, it doesn't always work. And unfortunately, like I was saying, a lot of times when it doesn't work, we don't necessarily get good feedback on it because the person just decides to show up. And of course, we try to follow up, and people who don't make follow-ups or miss their appointments or something like that, we try to get to the bottom of it, kind of what went wrong. I'll talk about side effects in a second, or kind of adverse reactions, because that certainly is one kind of reason why a person might not have success with it. But and just, I would say the main thing is just taking it exactly as prescribed. Despite the simplicity of it, uh, you're going to take this buzz blocking medication before you drink. It really is hard to be perfect with that. That something short of perfection might really kind of prevent it from working. Prior to drinking, you really have to have this adequate blockade 100% of the time. And we know that in medicine, just generally speaking, that's a very hard task, whether it be a multivitamin, whether it be recommendations from a dentist to floss daily, or whatever it might be. I mean, it's hard to really consistently do that. So I definitely sympathize with people who occasionally miss doses, or what have you. So we really focus a lot on trying to have strategies to minimize that. So that's the one type of kind of thing. Why it might not work is because, in some sense, it doesn't ask much of a person other than to be perfect in this very specific way. The other thing is, the person might just simply not be able to take it due to tolerability issues. It's not that common that someone just kind of flat out could not take it at some dose. Usually, there have been situations where we've had to have it compounded, get it to a compound pharmacy and really get a small dose of it, which they're actually more, because low dose naltrexone, which is that's not related to the Sinclair method as such, but because that has become more kind of common treatment for types of like inflammatory pain conditions, things like that. So it's pretty easy to get it compounded at a pharmacy now. So a lot of times we can start at lower doses, but people do have intolerable gastrointestinal side effects, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, something like that, or other kinds of adverse reactions. One of the things that's interesting too, it's kind of wild to think about, but naltrexone, most of the manufacturers of it, I think there's only one, and I think that they may have not even exist anymore, but they all contain lactose, like as an inactive ingredient. So a lot of times, it is important to know if you're lactose intolerant, because, especially if you're really hypersensitive to lactose, because the inactive ingredient in naltrexone is lactose. So that in that case, you would expect some type of GI upset that was really independent of the blockade of the opioid receptors. You definitely want to take it with a full meal, because we think of these kind of brain chemicals like serotonin, dopamine, in this case opioid receptors. All of those really are gastrointestinal in origin. Most of our serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, opioid, most of those receptors are in our GI tract, and that's why all of those really upset stomach's a common problem. So that can be a problem. I will say to that though, one thing is kind of the standard Sinclair method approach. If you read The Cure for Alcoholism, or just kind of even kind of the basic approach that we have, is that the first 2 days, half of a 50 milligram tablet with a full meal, not just food. But I even would say that maybe even a quarter of a tablet the first time. Most of the tablets, I understand, are pretty easy to break into a quarter of a tablet. And I would say that just because, most people don't need to do that. Most people don't even really need to do half a tablet, but you don't know if you're that person or not. So that's why we always really err on the side of caution. But I would say maybe even the first time we could spare, maybe 5 to 10% of people by having just a quarter of a tab of the full meal this first time, with the idea that this is a long-term program. So kind of an extra day or two where you're not getting adequate enough blockade. I mean, that's a very, very small price to pay to kind of increase the number of people who are going to be able to take this. The other thing is sometimes medications don't work, whether it be a blood pressure medication, and we don't quite know. We're learning more and more about the way that particular enzymes are involved with the metabolism of a certain drug. And so I think that's going to be handy more and more. There's a company called GeneSight. There are a few of them, but for sure GeneSight that has naltrexone as part of their panel. And you can get information about how your specific your specific enzymes influence the rate of metabolism. So sometimes, let's say, for example, someone is a very slow metabolizer. In other words, they don't really break it down. So essentially, the level of naltrexone is much higher than you would expect. Well, then that person might have side effects, but really they could do very well with just 25 milligrams as a treatment dose. On the other hand, someone might be a rapid metabolizer, and they just break it down very, very quickly. In which case they would feel nothing maybe, and they would maybe need a 75 milligrams or a higher dose than average. So there definitely is that where you kind of have to, the vast majority of people are going to do fine with 50 milligrams, but there are some kind of underlying genetic reasons that they might be metabolizing it differently than average.
So fascinating. So do you see in the future perhaps people will be taking these tests to see, how quickly they metabolize naltrexone so that the dosage could be right for them?
Yeah, exactly. Especially, and really an insurance company, or especially if you're talking about scale, the types of information you get for one person
Yeah.
it can be beneficial. It kind of takes it makes it a better educated guess. In other words, the odds are slightly more in your favor. But if you're talking about, like, say, an insurance company that has 10,000 members, or a hospital that has thousands of admissions, and you do this type of testing across a large population, then you're really going to see that that it really can make a big difference. There are certain SSRIs, which are like Prozac and Zoloft and these types of meds for depression and anxiety. Certain people have the way their enzymes, it's just not going to work for them. I mean, it's just a complete waste of time to prescribe it. Or they're very, very slow metabolizers, and if you start them at the normal dose, they're going to be vomiting or whatever. So if you knew that, then you wouldn't have to go through this whole sequence of types of things. But that, for sure, I think it seems inevitable that it would just be almost kind of a standard medical thing that you have here, these DNA tests, and they tell you, right now it's really about kind of the rate of metabolism. It tells you kind of, are you a normal metabolizer? Do you have these particular enzymes that are associated with efficacy or not? But I think more and more you will see that it just really, instead of going through 3 or 4 different antidepressants, you can make it 1 or 2 with this type of information, something like that. Like, you improve the situation. And probably, who knows? I mean, one of the kind of things about naltrexone that is often talked about is the fact that it is generic, and that there aren't kind of financial incentives to find out certain things about it that there might otherwise be. But if you think of say something like antidepressants, they are different. Like, say, SSRIs, like Prozac and Zoloft and Paxil and Lexapro. Those are the common ones. They're essentially, we say, well, there's one particular way they work, but they are slightly different. There are variations on the same theme. And some of them work for some people, and some, so you could find something like that, where you have these opioid antagonists like naltrexone, but it's slightly different. It's slightly metabolized in this particular way, or the way it, its obstruction of this particular receptor is slightly different in that it translates into some percentage of people working in a different way. So that's one thing, is that we only really have, I think at some point, if there is some financial incentive to do so, we might have several variations on the same theme. And then that small subgroup of people who, it's currently not working for, we would be able to kind of bring them into the fold as well. But the basic idea that we need to block the reward for this, I mean, that's just going to be true. And then it's just finding these kind of safe chemical ways to do that.
Yeah. So helpful. And I wanted to go back real quick to the side effects you were talking about, because the common few that I hear, I just wonder if you could speak to these ones. People want to know, will naltrexone impact my mood? Does it impact my sex drive or other pleasures in general?
So there, I guess there are kind of two basic answers to that. Well, I guess there's one basic answer. It's all of those are possible. I guess I'll talk about mood first. So oftentimes that's probably the most common question, I would say, I taking this medication, it's going to block my endorphins. I have endorphins released with food, sex, running, all these other kinds of things. What about that? So that's one of the most common concerns, and it's a good question. So that's there is a reason to think that might happen to you if you take naltrexone. Now, the exact percentage, it's hard to say, and even if we knew the exact percentage, we could say 30% of people, and that'd actually be high. Even the GI upset's only about 15 to 20%. So, but let's just say it happens to 30% of people. They have some sort of negative effect on their mood. Of course, that still wouldn't tell you anything about the individual. It's like, I want to know if Brian, if this is going to happen to me when I take this. You're still kind of thinking in probabilities. But it is always worth considering that is a possible side effect. So I think it is important for people to realize, this could possibly happen. But I will say it most likely won't happen. And when it does happen, there's a couple of things. One is it's not usually at 50 milligrams. Most people are at, that's kind of the dose. That's kind of the universal dose for Sinclair Method is 50 milligrams. So it doesn't usually happen to that. If we see it, and I'll tell you exactly what the it is in just a second, but if we do see that kind of reduction in mood or enthusiasm, it's usually at 75 or 100 milligrams. In other words, it's at these higher doses. So most people are going to take the standard dose. You're probably not going to see it. When we do see it, it's usually not depression. It's not usually that, say, naltrexone makes someone depressed. It's more like, let's say, a flattening, like kind of an emotional flattening, a dulling. A kind of a reduction in enthusiasm. Some particular activity used to be an 8 out of 10, and now it's a 6 out of 10, something like that. So it's not an across the board, the person doesn't enjoy life, they're suicidal even, or some, it's not really depression as much as it is just a flattening, a lack of enthusiasm, sort of like a dull gray day or something like that. Kind of the sheen is taken off some of these activities. So we can see that sometimes, for sure. One of the things too, remember though, like and running is kind of like the famous one, just because it's called runner's high. We actually have a name for it when you have these endorphins released. One interesting thing, well, it's true generally that endorphins are not the only chemical involved with reinforcement. In other words, when we are reinforced and essentially encouraged to repeat these particular behaviors, it's rare that, and I'm not aware of any, where just solely just an issue of endorphins. Of course, in runner's high, we're learning that the endogenous cannabinoid system is highly involved with running. So you're essentially having, your natural cannabis being released as part of a reward. Then, of course, you have adrenaline, and then, of course, you just have the psychological satisfaction. So there are all kinds of things like for running, that even if you did not receive these particular endorphins, it would still be a rewarding experience. But I think the main thing, or a couple things, I guess there are two main things. One is that it's always important to remember and to kind of think about treatment in terms of kind of, beginning treatment, and then kind of maintenance, long run treatment. If you're a daily drinker, yes, you might be probably going to, if you're a daily drinker for sure, you're going to be taking it every single day. So at the beginning of treatment, you're going to be taking this naltrexone a lot more. By month 3, by month 6, by year 1, you're going down the road. You're just really, the idea is that you're just really not going to be taking this, certainly not on a daily basis, but on an as needed basis. So if it is something that you experience as kind of emotional flattening, it's not going to be a daily thing that you have to endure. It's not something, it might be a short-term problem at the beginning, but it's not going to be something that you have to live with, so to speak. But I think the main thing to think about, and this is true just about with anything, any kind of concern that people have about naltrexone, that concern is almost always actually doubly true for alcohol. It's alcohol that really is the central nervous system depressant. It's really alcohol that creates mood disorders, that creates anxiety disorders, that creates sleep trouble, that creates erectile dysfunction, that creates all these other things. So just I want people to keep in mind that if it does cause these things, it's really kind of a short-term price to pay. And then also, given the fact that you're going to be just removing this just very toxic substance that causes even more of that same problem, you're taking that out of the equation. So I think on the whole, people, the small percentage of people who experience that, they seem to think, most of them think that it's okay in the short run. It's very rare for someone to not kind of want to keep taking it for that particular side effect. There are more physical things that people just can't endure, but the kind of dialing back the enthusiasm for rewarding experiences is something that people understand is not something they're going to have to deal with forever.
Yeah. Yeah, really well said. And I just want to say from my own personal experience, I would sometimes describe it like I would just feel blue the day after drinking. But what I noticed for me is it wasn't always that way. It didn't happen every time after I took naltrexone. And if I did feel blue, it would last for like a day. And then if I, wasn't drinking the following day, or whether I was, like, I would feel fine. So I like to tell people, kind of like you said, it's like any negative consequences, at least in my experience, were far worth the long-term benefits of naltrexone and the Sinclair method. So it was a price I was willing to pay. And my physician also told me, like you said, it's like you have to remember alcohol is a depressant. So if you're blocking the reward you're getting from it, you could be, in some sense, enhancing the displeasurable effects or the depressing effects. So that was a really interesting kind of mindset shift for me. One thing I wanted to ask you about that, in the Sinclair Method world and reading The Cure for Alcoholism and David Sinclair's research, we talk a lot about the benefits of, the day or two after you've taken naltrexone, when it's washing out of your system, and being proactive about doing endorphin producing activities while your receptors are super sensitized and upregulated. Is that something you bear in mind in your practice and recommend to your patients, or what would you like to say about that piece of the Sinclair Method, essentially alcohol-free days when naltrexone isn't in the system?
Yeah, I mean, there is something to that, although we really don't know. It definitely makes sense for sure. You kind of you have these kind of receptors that might even be super sensitive, or at least hypersensitive to these rewarding experiences. So that on the days you're not taking the naltrexone, you're going to be kind of extra reinforced or extra rewarded for these positive behaviors. So definitely that makes sense. One of the things, a couple of things I'll say about that. One is that the naltrexone itself, and this is you can read this in the kind of the package insert, the kind of the long form information you get at the pharmacy. It talks about that you should really get adequate blockade for 24 hours. It's kind of a single 50 milligram dose will give you adequate blockade for 24 hours. Now, the active metabolite of naltrexone, which is a relevant part, kind of the parent, we say the parent molecule, which would just be naltrexone itself. but it's converted into the active metabolite, which is actually, you know, kind of responsible for the blockade. So the half-life of the active metabolite is around 13 hours. But if you want to know how long, not how long a medication works, that's a different question, but how long it stays in your system. In other words, how long, you know, kind of would we be able to detect some level of this this medicine? So it's true for all medicines, just a mathematical formula of, you know, you take half, 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 half. So basically, you multiply the half-life times 5. You know, so that's how long naltrexone is going to be in your system. But again, it's very, very diminishing. And of course, that last half is very, very small. So so one of the kind of difficulties of that idea is that you don't really know exactly how long or to what extent naltrexone is blocking your receptors the next day. So so it's hard to kind of maybe kind of to know exactly the benefits of that. On the other hand, I would definitely be, I'm always kind of cautious about discouraging activities like that. You know, in other words, I do not recommend that if someone has taken naltrexone and then they feel like running, you know, I would definitely encourage them to run. Please go exercise. Please, I would encourage people I would encourage them to not avoid meaningful, pleasurable, constructive activities simply because they had taken naltrexone. So now, because that really is kind of the whole point of the whole thing is just to start, you know, building your life in some meaningful way. So I don't actively kind of encourage that. But some people do that, and there's certainly, I don't discourage it either, this kind of timing, but I just, the utility of it is not, it's not so obvious to me, but a lot of people find that and it makes sense to them, and it doesn't, and so I don't discourage it. But I would just say, if you feel like exercising, by all means do it. If you feel like going to your music class, but you've taken your naltrexone, please do not avoid, you know, living in these meaningful ways simply because you've taken your naltrexone.
Yeah. I'm really glad you brought that up because I remember when I first started the Sinclair Method and I learned that kind of the washout period and, you know, taking advantage of those days. I was like trying to really micromanage, like, oh, I took naltrexone, I'm going out, I shouldn't dance at this wedding. And I was just like, it was so much work that I was like, screw it, I'm just going to do what I want to do. And people often ask me that, you know, should I avoid this activity because I took naltrexone that day? And I think I totally agree with what you said about, you know, you're really part of this journey is creating a life that revolves less around alcohol. And if that means you want to go on a walk right after you took naltrexone, like, do it. You know, it's not a big deal.
That's right. And I think the micromanaging is something you want to get away from because I would say, like I mentioned earlier, there are just a couple of things you need to do, be perfect with those things, but really try not to micromanage it because it's kind of like, the more you squeeze a bar of soap, you know, the harder it is to hold. It's kind of hard to let go of something and then also kind of micromanage it at the same time. So I really kind of encourage people to kind of make sure you do not drink unless you've taken it. But other things, I would say, I would just encourage people to relax around it and really try to think about, what can I do with my life? What do I want, you know, what kind of relationships do I want to build? You know, those types of things, and micromanage those if you must micromanage something, versus trying to micromanage all of these Sinclair things.
That's great advice. I love that perspective.